Good day, everyone. This is Tan Kiwi. Today I'm going to talk about inflation and the two emerging currency blocks. The first question I will ask is, can we trust what we read from the MSM? I say this because 3 years ago, news about Hunter Biden's laptop was suppressed by MSM. No one knew about it, or rather the American electorate didn't know that such a laptop existed. Because if it did, there are a lot of incriminating information there that would have undermined Joe Biden's chances of becoming a US president. It's only about 3 months ago, after Elon Musk bought Twitter, that we realized that, wow, FBI was involved in suppressing news about this laptop. And not only that, in the past few weeks, we are also learning that it's not just Hunter Biden's laptop. Twitter has also been suppressing a lot of medical experts' views on the virus. Besides that, there are many other events that we don't really know the truth. For instance, was this virus man-made? Was the medicine that we were asked to take, was it designed to heal or to kill? Another question, who is really winning the war in Ukraine? Our views really depend on what we read. And unfortunately, what we read are by journalists, and a lot of them are paid to write in a certain way. The American government has two big budgets for journalists to write in a certain way. It came out in 2021 and 2022. I bring that up because I also have been reading. I don't know whether it's the right sources or not. But what I'm expressing here is a reflection of what I've read. I shall begin chapter 1. Why the truth is important for us. It's important because if we know the truth, let's say before FTX collapsed, then we can either get out, avoid losing money, or short and make lots of money. But it's not just investment data that sometimes can be misleading. GDP figures and inflation figures, governments also try to shield us from the truth. They have a good reason. They don't want us to panic, because maybe when we panic, the total disadvantage is greater for the society. Let's take, for instance, US inflation. The latest figure is that it is 6.4%, and it peaked at 9% last year. Are you one of those who doubt this? Well, you are not alone, because many people also doubt that inflation is only around 6%. And for some of us, we refer to an alternative measure of inflation, and it showed that actually it's about 14%. So inflation, according to another measure, is much higher than what we are told. We want to know the truth because inflation will determine interest rates. Interest rates can determine our wealth, and our wealth could determine our health. These are all important things to us. Let's look at the impact of higher interest rates. The US Fed raised interest rates in early 2022 from 0.25 to its current 4.75. What's the impact of that? Well, stock prices have fallen, bond prices have fallen, and property prices have fallen too. So every market has been affected. Let's give you an example how the impact of rising interest rates can affect us, most of us who have property. In the past 40 years, interest rates have fallen from 20% to 4.75. Okay? Now, when interest rates fall, greed steps in. We can pay less in mortgages and we buy a bigger house. And that's exactly what happened to most of us. Let's say in 2007, a house costs $500,000. Interest rates was 5%, so the mortgage that we pay is $25,000 a year. 2 years ago, because of all the rush into property prices went up to 1.5 million. Interest rates fell to 1%, and the mortgage that we paid in 2021 was 15,000. So imagine you can buy a bigger house and pay less in mortgage. Well, in the past year, interest rates have gone up. And now for the same amount of property at 5%, we are paying $75,000 a year. So how do you think it affects us? A lot of us might not be able to pay up this new mortgage rate. So a lot of people in the US are in difficulties because the mortgage rates have gone up and they can't pay. But this simple behavior of greed is multiplied throughout all the sectors of the market. Look at this chart. In the past 40 years, the bond markets, stock markets have all ballooned. In 2020, the crypto market was 1 trillion. And of course, the total GDP of all the countries of the world is only about around here, 85 trillion. As you know, this was before the bull run during the pandemic, because during the bull run, crypto capitalization went up to 3 trillion. Today it's back to 1. Stock markets went up to 124. Today is around 90. And bond markets, well, thankfully it's still around the same level. Now, I've spoken about property market, stock market, and bond market. In the forex market, similar dangers exist. Let's look at this BIS report. It came out a few months ago. It showed that actually there are $80 trillion worth of forex swaps that's going to mature this year. Okay, just imagine you borrow money on a fixed mortgage rate, and now you have to renew it at higher interest rates. It's the same for those forex swappers. They borrowed or swap at a lower interest rates, and now they have to pay higher interest rates this year. Now, what are forex swaps? Basically, if you are a US company and you operate in Europe, if you want to borrow euros, the banks there will charge you higher interest rates. It's the same for a European company operating in the US. If they want to borrow US dollars, the American banks will charge them higher interest rates. So what these two companies do is, well, the US company borrow US dollar, European companies borrow euro dollar, and then we swap. So this has been happening, $80 trillion worth of it. And by the end of this year, 80 trillion are up for renewal. If we take into account that interest rates have gone up, and the past 2 years, inflation and recession means that a lot of companies didn't make money, they are in trouble. If we go back 14 years, there was a similar crisis, the subprime mortgage crisis. At that time, interest rates started to rise, house prices started to fall, and then we landed in big trouble. Well, it looks like we are heading towards the same danger. I'm not saying we are going to, definitely, but chances are very high. In 2007, the total US mortgages was $2.3 trillion. Today, we're looking at $80 trillion. So that is a bigger, far bigger problem that we have to deal with. That means to say if rates continue to rise, this house of cards that we live in will collapse again. The question is, what will stop interest rates from rising? Well, of course, the usual answer is a recession. Is a recession coming? Well, if we take into account the difference between the 10-year and the 2-year bond yield, which is normally quite a good indicator of a coming recession, when it is below zero, it means a recession is coming. You look at the past 40 years, it's been like this. Going ahead, now that we're below zero, it looks like a recession is coming. Here's another indicator. In December, the St. Louis Fed came out with a report. Now there are 50 states in the USA. Out of the 50 states, 27 were in recession. 27 out of 50, that means the majority of US states were in recession. And this was October 2022, which means to say it is possible that the US recession has started already. Here's another report to show that things are not doing well. The Baltic Exchange Index, this is a shipping rates. It shot up during the COVID years to 5,005. Now it's fallen back to pre-COVID level of $552, which means to say no one is exporting, no one is renting ships, and so things must be bad. Jerome Powell told us that he will not increase interest rates that much more. Today is 4.75, maybe 5.5, 6%. And of course, what he said, MSM will repeat what he said. This shouldn't surprise us. But if you believe them, then you'll be like this pig who's been given a lift by this man. And this pig thinks that this man is a nice man. But in fact, he has different designs on the pig. What I'm saying is that we will get a recession plus inflation this year. Why? Why do I say that? There are many reasons. Number one, the US Fed has printed too much money all these 40 years. During the COVID crisis, the US government gave out $5 trillion as handouts. And not only that, oops, I overshot. Look at this arrow. This is during the Lehman Brothers crisis when Ben Bernanke increased the money supply. But compared to the amount of money that Jerome Powell increased in 2020, what happened in the 2007-2008 is nothing. In the past 3 years, Jerome Powell has increased the money supply 5 times, from under 4 trillion to 20 over trillion dollars. US Fed is not the only guilty one. All central banks of the world have done the same, printed lots of money. And of course, in the past 30, 40 years of financialization of the G7 economies, which means that they all move away from manufacturing into investment products. This has multiplied the amount of money many, many times over. Third reason, the sanctions on Russian exports has been inflationary. Because we all depend on Russian exports of food and energy. Okay, and we're still feeling it today. Of course, someone will say, look, the oil price is down. It used to be 110, and now it's back to pre-invasion or Ukraine invasion level. Well, there are 2 good reasons for it. Number one, the winter in Europe has been quite mild this year. And secondly, the US has this stockpile of oil, and they've been siphoning off this past year. So that adds supply to the market and brought down the price of oil. But going forward, with OPEC cutting back, there'll be less supply of oil in the market. So I expect inflation to come back. Another reason, the Chinese economy is open, which means more demand for oil, which means oil prices will go up again. Last reason, what's Russia's reaction to this US-led Ukraine conflict will prolong inflation. When I say US-led West, I mean the G7 and all the countries of NATO and EU. Now, just a clarification, when I say US-led West or when I say Russia, I mean the political class. Because not all Russians agree with what Putin is doing, and not all Americans or Europeans agree with what their political class is doing. But of course, this political class are in power, and they'll do things which some say benefit themselves. And if things don't turn out, well, they'll just take their money and run off, which is what Zelensky can do anytime. He's already got PR in Britain. He's got lots of money all over the world. If things turn hot for him, he can just scoot off too. And now I come to chapter 2, and I'm going to explain why Russia's reaction in this Ukraine conflict will prolong inflation in the EU. Russia has actually turned from the west to the east because of this conflict. Now it trades with more countries in the east and the south, India, China. And if Russia does that, and EU doesn't get its cheap energy and food, inflation in EU will be prolonged. On top of that, Russia is forging new trade routes. Before, to move things from St. Petersburg to India, Russian goods has to go through Baltic Sea, North Sea, Mediterranean Sea, and back to India. Well, they are building this international north-south corridor. And when that opens, all the businesses in between the old routes will be cut off. On top of that, Russia used to supply gas to Germany and Europe through Nord Stream. Right now, they are building the power of Siberia too. This will be ready in 2030, and when that is done, all the gas that used to go to Europe will now be diverted to China. How can this not weaken the EU economy? Well, what's going to happen? EU will face inflation and deindustrialization. So the question is, why is Russia doing this? Why is it punishing the US-led West? Basically, Russia feels betrayed. And actually, the story began more than 30 years ago. It began after the Berlin Wall fell, which was in November, and in December, both sides, USSR and US, decided to end the Cold War at this Malta summit. A year later, 2 years later, USSR collapsed. Well, it collapsed because maybe the centrally planned economy didn't work. And in the aftermath of the collapse, New Russia wanted to learn about capitalism from the West. And so it opened its markets to Western capitalism. The trouble was Yeltsin was his period was marked by chaos and corruption. And the Western capitalists took advantage. They enriched a few Russians and exploited the rest. That's what happened. So bad was it that in 1996, somebody, a Russian, wanted to change this. He wanted to take over Yeltsin's presidential position. But of course, the West did not like that. So what the West did was to meddle in Russian presidential election in 1996 and kept Yeltsin in power because they love him. And this was written up in a Time magazine article in 1996, talking about Western interference in other countries. Towards the end of 1999, Yeltsin was ill and sick, and he felt that the only person he trusted that would promote Russia was Putin. Putin at that time was an unknown, but he was known for being an honest and incorruptible man. But the West embraced him because they thought that Putin is like Yeltsin, and he will allow the Western capitalists to continue to exploit Russia. Well, it didn't turn out that way. Putin did the reverse. And I suppose for many Russians, life has improved a lot. In a sense, in the early years of China, it was like this as well. Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, it was marked by massive corruption. Perhaps that's one of the things we have to accept in any developing country, all this corruption. But in 2013, Xi Jinping came in and changed that. A lot of people will say that China has improved since. The US-led West not only tripped Russia's economic development, they also threatened Russia's existence. Why do I say that? It goes back to an old theory in 1904, written by this Englishman, Harold Mackinder. His theory is this: whoever controls East Europe will control the heartland. That means the European Asian continent. And whoever controls the European Asian continent controls the world. This is a very popular theory, and it was promoted again in 1997 by Brzezinski. He was advocating that all US policies should be to deny Russia this dominance in the heartland. And the key to this is to control Ukraine, because Ukraine has, through Crimea, had the warm ports, which the Russian Navy needs a lot. Balkanization is another topic, which means breaking up Russia into many, many republics. Because once Russia is broken up into many, many republics, it's easier to exploit Russia. Look at the map of Russia. It's 3 times bigger than Europe. It has so many untapped resources to exploit. And that's the idea, to exploit Russia. This idea of breaking up Russia is not new. It is still very much alive. A few weeks ago in Brussels, there was a conference in January to talk about how do you break up Russia. It is ironic that while the US-led West has always been scheming to break up Russia, Russia's attitude towards the West was entirely different. Russia was in love with Western values and culture since Peter the Great's time. This quote from Putin says it all. In year 2000, he said that Russia should be part of European culture. In that same year, he approached Clinton and asked that Russia join NATO. His request was ignored. This leads us to the Ukraine war, which is the central conflict now. Way back in 1990, Germany, the two Germanys wanted to unite, but they sort of got permission from USSR. Gorbachev said that no problem for the two Germanys to unite, provided NATO doesn't expand. And he was sort of promised that NATO will not expand 1 inch east by James Baker. But it turned out none of this happened. And since 1990, 14 countries have joined NATO. The trouble in Ukraine is that Ukraine is too close to Moscow. If Ukraine becomes a NATO country, nuclear weapons can be installed and Moscow will be just a few minutes away. That's what Russians fear. Another thing, the Russian-speaking Ukrainians in East Ukraine have been harassed by the Ukraine government in Kiev since 2014 actually. And of course, as Russia wanted to protect its Russian-speaking Ukrainians. This led us to two agreements in 2014 and 2015, whereby France, Germany, Ukraine, Russia all agreed that we must not harass the Russian-speaking Ukrainians in the East. But was this carried out? Apparently not. Last year, Poroshenko, the ex-president of Ukraine, said that there was no intention to fulfill this agreement. True, he's not a major figure in history, but a few months later, in December, Angela Merkel said the same thing. She said that Russia was deceived by the West. She said that the Minsk agreement, there was no intention to honor the agreement. The agreement was signed to give Ukraine army more time to build up to fight Russia. A few days later, Francois Hollande said the same thing. Imagine, this is what actually Russia has been thinking about for many months and years. And when these two admitted, Russia realized that it has really been fooled. Not once, maybe not even twice, more than that. On top of that, the US-led West continues its warmongering. Baerbock says we must fight against Russia. Boris Johnson says we must send more arms, weapons to Ukraine to fight Russia. Imagine you are Russian. You are in love with the EU. And after all this that they have done to you, you can only come to two conclusions. Number one, this girl cannot be trusted. Number two, this girl wants to destroy Russia. So what do you do with a wife who cheats, lies, and abuses her husband? Remember this case between Amber Heard and Johnny Depp? It was a big case last year. Apparently she lied 2 times, did everything bad to Johnny Depp and wanted to sue him for defamation. But the court ruled against her, and it says she lost. So Russia, in a sense, faced the same situation as Johnny Depp. So what should you do? Well, the only solution Russia can do, and that's what Johnny Depp did, was to get a divorce. And that's what Russia is doing. We just talked about how disappointed Russia was with their infatuation with the West. And like Johnny Depp, they've come up with a divorce plan. This divorce plan is purely speculative on my part. But if you play chess and you look at how the pieces move, you understand what I mean. Because immediately after Merkel's shocking revelation, a lot of moves were made. Number one, on 19th of December, Putin suddenly flew to Belarus, together with his foreign minister and defense minister. He even postponed his State of the Union address till February this year. At that time, people thought, oh, why is he going to Belarus? Is it because they are planning to attack Ukraine from the north? Because there are Russian troops in Belarus. But I don't think so. I think that's because Russia in December realized that the war may be coming to an end in Ukraine. But the war with the West is going to continue. But this time it'll be through Poland. Poland will be the new proxy for NATO. All the weapons that you read about, tanks or jets, they are not going to Ukraine. They are going to Poland. Why? Why is Poland involved? If you look at history, this red border is the current borders of Poland. But you look at history, Poland used to occupy western parts of Belarus and western parts of Ukraine. Perhaps the leaders in Poland feel that they ought to reclaim their ancient territories. At the same time, when Putin was in Belarus, he sent Medvedev to Beijing. This is unusual because normally the number 2 of a state does not meet up with the number 1 of a state unless something special. Medvedev might have been flown there to give Xi Jinping a special message. I believe so. I believe Russia has enlisted China in its divorce plan. And what is this divorce plan? Very simple. Russia will continue the fighting and China will do the manufacturing. This is the map of the world. And what this divorce plan is, Russia will continue fighting in Europe and it will supply all the oil, gas and food to China. In return, China will supply all the manufactured goods to Russia to sustain its economy. And in return, China will continue to sell goods to the rest of the world. So nothing is disrupted. I say this also because a few days later, after Medvedev left China, Wang Yi, who was the foreign minister, stepped down and they put Jin Gang in his place. Jin Gang is less of a wolf warrior. Mind you, Wang Yi has not been demoted, but just that maybe China feels that we don't want to antagonize the West with someone who's always saying nasty things to the West. Not that Wang Yi does that all the time, but you get the idea. In the meantime, in December, the opposition in Taiwan won a landslide local election. So to China, Taiwan is less of a problem now. When Medvedev went back to Russia, he was given a new position. In this new position, he is now in charge of everything military, whether it's sourcing, recruitment of soldiers, everything, logistics, that's under him now. So obviously, it's not a temporary appointment, it's a permanent job. Obviously, Russia thinks that the war is a full-time job. A few days later, the commander in charge of Ukraine, Sorovikin, was removed. Well, he's now in charge of the Russian Air Force, and they brought in a new guy. He is of a high rank, and he has more resources for this battle or this fight ahead. A few days later, Russia announced that it's going to expand the number of soldiers by 30% in the next few years. All this to me indicates that Russia is prepared for a long war with the West. In fact, Russia is building a Great Wall in Europe, just like the Chinese built a Great Wall centuries ago, because they want to keep out the northern barbarians. China was not interested in the resources in the north, and Russia is not interested in the resources in Europe because it has more than enough resources that have yet to be tapped. So all Russia wants to do is to prevent the West from attacking it. Both Russia and China realize this. Russia is fighting not only Ukraine, it is the whole US-led West. And once Russia is defeated, China would be next. And so it is in China's interest to be part of this divorce plan. This divorce plan has actually two legs. Number one, you continue to send your goods, Russian goods, to the east and south, and this will make the inflation and deindustrialization in Europe worse. Continue to engage them in the military, because apparently the West hasn't got the capability to produce enough ammunition and missiles. And of course, if Russia is engaging with the West, it delays the plan to attack China. And we all know that it has been written that in 2025, China's military will be better than the US or equal. So it's just a few more years for China to build up its military. That's the first leg. The second leg of this divorce plan is about to kick in. And this second leg is de-dollarization. This is actually the real war. The fighting Ukraine is not the real war. The real war is the currency war. So which means you get rid of your US bonds. And the world has been getting rid of the US bonds since the second half of last year. We don't have the latest figures because they are not out yet. But the thing is, all this selling of US bonds should have depressed prices and shot up interest rates even more. And that'll be bad for the US economy. But what did the US Fed do? Well, it covered this large-scale selling of US bonds through the repo market. This is an overnight market whereby if you want cash, you hand in your bonds and get cash overnight. And so the Fed is in it, okay? The Fed goes in and say, I buy bonds from you and I give you cash. This is called reverse repurchase agreement, RRP. And the Fed has been doing a lot the past year. Look at this chart. Since mid-2021, the Fed has been buying up bonds every night to the tune of $2 trillion. So that keeps the demand for treasuries there, and it keeps interest rates from shooting up even further. Besides selling bonds, of course, stop using the US dollars. And of course, China and Russia, they're all doing that, and many other countries too. Russia and Iran is thinking of coming out with a cryptocurrency. Brazil and Argentina coming out with a common currency. Something significant happened in December last year, and that's when Xi Jinping visited the Middle East. This is a big thing for both sides because the most important takeaway is that they all decided to sell China oil and gas for renminbi. This means to say the petrodollar and the petro yuan are now existing side by side. Just now I spoke about the emerging petro yuan, and this will lead to the two emerging currency blocks, which I'm going to dwell on the next few minutes. What this means is that we will have two different currencies in these two different blocks. And this, because they are both be getting different oil prices, one higher and one lower, it will lead to many, many things. For one, different inflation rates. USA, in fact, this is already the current inflation rates in the US, 6.4, in China is 2.1. Interest rates in the US, 4.75, going up to 5.75 or 6, and in China, it's 3.65. What will happen in the long run, in the longer run? Well, growth rates will fall in that block with higher interest rates and higher energy prices. And the bloc with the lower energy prices and lower interest rates, it will grow. And of course, later on, these two currency blocks will split up. When? Well, it will be when the BRICS currency appears. When I say BRICS, I mean the BRICS itself, plus the Belt and Road Initiative countries and the SCO countries. This was actually first mentioned in June last year by Putin. He said that they are coming out with a new reserve currency to replace the dollar. Although he mentioned that it would be a basket of fiat currencies, logic says that it would be simpler if it's based on commodities. And of all commodities, gold is the easiest to base on. A lot of people have taken the hint and they have been buying gold. In fact, the past few years, a lot of central banks have been buying gold in anticipation that the fiat currency era will be over. How much is gold price now? Well, it's below $2,000. If the BRICS currency comes out tomorrow, how much will it be valued? There are two guesses. The first guess is, one way of calculating the price of a fiat currency is to divide the amount of fiat currency you have by the amount of gold you have. That's one of the standard ways. And if we take US dollar and the amount of gold that US has, then it should work out to about $71,000. That's very high. That could be extreme. So let's look at the other way. Another way of measuring the gold price is to go back to 1971, when the price of oil was $3.56 and the price of gold was $42, which gives a fraction of 0.08. Today, assuming oil is $80 and gold is about $2,000, the fraction is 0.04, which means that for oil producers today, they're getting half of the gold they get compared to 1971. So for them, it will be more fair if gold is priced at $4,000 an ounce, or oil goes up to $160. So that's the figures that we're playing with. So when will the BRICS currency appear? A year ago, I said that within 2 to 5 years. Now it has been shortened to 1 to 4 years. The BRICS will be meeting in August this year, and I think that they will probably introduce the currency either end of this year or next year. So could be as early as 1 year. And what happens next? If the US dollar has no backing, which it hasn't got, a lot of people will feel more comfortable holding on to a currency that has some gold backing. So what will happen? All the US dollars will be returned to the US because nobody wants to touch it. In a similar way, this happened to pound sterling in the 1960s and 70s, when pound sterling became no longer the reserve currency. It worsened inflation in Britain then. Now, when this happens, if all the money in the world, the US dollars in the world, goes back to the USA, that means the US bloc will face hyperinflation. Basically, hyperinflation is when more money chase after fewer goods. And to stop this, interest rates have to rise. Give you a case study. Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe had hyperinflation period about 10 over years ago. What happened was there was a land reform, output fell, tax revenues fell, so the government started printing money, and so hyperinflation happened between maybe 2004 right up to 2009. Hyperinflation stopped in 2009 when the government decided, okay, we no longer will use the Zimbabwean dollar, we will use the US dollar. After that, inflation died down. But now Zimbabwe is facing a second hyperinflation. That's because in 2018, the central bank decided to print their own currency again. Within a few months, prices shot up to as high as 800%. Today is about 200%. How much did the Zimbabwe central bank print? Well, it went slowly. By 2020, it started to shoot up. So in the past 3 years, the Zimbabwe central bank has increased money supply by 18 times to get an inflation of 200% a year. Now, the US Fed printed 5 times more only. So don't expect 200% inflation. That's not going to happen. But inflation will be high. In response to that, interest rates in the Zimbabwe shot up to 200%. So expect US dollar interest rates to shoot up as well. Definitely not 200%. And normally what happens is that the currency will plunge. In the case of Zimbabwean dollar, it weakened from 30 Zimbabwean dollar to $1 US to today's 800 Zimbabwean dollar to $1 US. And that's going to happen to the US dollar too. Now, none of this was happening in Zimbabwe. Most of us are not aware of. Why? Very simple. Because we don't use Zimbabwe dollar. And if you don't use the US dollar, when that happens to the US bloc, you won't feel it too. Of course, it's easier said than done. Most of us cannot get our US dollar quick enough. But you have the time frame, start preparing for it. Because in the new scenario, the BRICS currency bloc will have stable prices and low interest rates. This past year, we have seen this deadly sequence of events. Actions by the US-led West was an existential threat to Russia. In response, Russia diversified its trade and de-dollarized and got everyone on board to de-dollarize too. And this now has become an existential threat to the US-led West. So basically, we are facing inflation and recession. Definitely in the US dollar bloc. And Russia's response has accelerated the de-dollarization move. And this has created two currency blocs. When the BRICS currency arrives, and I mentioned it between 1 to 4 years' time, it will be terrible for US bloc because it will face the situation which, not to the same extent as Zimbabwe is facing now. Since the dollar is the lifeblood of the US empire, the US empire will collapse. What are they going to do about it? De-escalate or escalate? Well, looking at what's happening, apparently they are escalating. A few weeks ago, Seymour Hersh wrote an article, and he said that the US was the one responsible for blowing up the Nord Stream pipelines last September. Now, he mentioned 4 people in the ring, and they are, besides Biden, Blinken, Nuland, and Sullivan. They were behind the bombing. These are probably the extreme neocons. And not only that, Norway was together with the US in bombing the pipelines. Some people think that this is an act of war. Well, it could be because you actually destroyed the German economy and you actually destroyed Russian property. In December 1941, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. Now, after that, USA declared war on Japan. Russia has not declared war on Norway or USA, maybe because there were no casualties. Otherwise, it's bye-bye for all of us. You will not be here to listen to me. But The neocons message is still loud and clear. In the recent Munich Security Conference, all the participants continue to say, fight, fight, fight. This is the bad news. But let's bring you some good news. I think there's some pushback against the neocons. Besides Hunter Biden's laptop, now they're trying to go after Biden for keeping classified documents. On top of that, in late January, Rand Corporation, which is an arm of Pentagon, wrote an article which says that it's not wise to continue the war in Ukraine. We should call for peace. This is definitely not a neocon message. So someone in the Pentagon believes that we should pull back. You know, when Hirsch wrote the article, he had very intimate details. Obviously, some anti-neocons help him with the information. So there's a growing number of people who are against the neocons. And of course, in February, we are getting more and more rallies in Washington and Britain. Whether this will expand further, we don't know. I have this view. America must change direction. Its government must focus and help Americans. They need your help. Don't focus on Ukrainians. If you look at history, there are many episodes like this in many countries. You go back 70 years in China, there was this cultural revolution when people went mad, destroying things, killing people. Many bad things were done. After 10 over years, China woke up and decided to blame it on the Gang of Four. The most important thing is after this episode, China changed direction and became what it is today. America can do that if the neocons are removed, because I believe without the neocons, America can still be great. I'm going to end up with two more slides. If the neocons don't kill all of us, then this Russia war will be a pivotal moment in history. 2022 will be a year when the global economy accelerated east. And what will this new world look like? Joseph Borrell in October last year said that the world as he saw it is divided into a garden and a jungle. Europe is the garden and the rest of the world is the jungle. Not many will agree with him, but on the same context, if these two emerging currency blocks continue, then in the years to come, I believe that we will have a BRICS oasis in a global desert. Thank you very much for tuning in.